All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the December 6th meeting of the Gateway API Gamma initiative. As always, Kubernetes Code of Conduct rules are in effect, so please treat each other respectfully. And with that, we can get started. Share my screen. And if there is anyone who was present at the last Gamma meeting who is interested in recapping, I would certainly appreciate that, as I was out of office.
I could probably do a quick recap.
That sounds great. And feel free to lean on the notes if that helps.
Yeah, I'm looking over the notes and trying to remember if there was anything that didn't make it into the notes that I thought would maybe be worth expanding on. I don't really think so. I think the notes did a pretty decent job of it. Let's see. Pull 1493, we kind of got to the point of going, yeah, we should just go ahead and accept this one and realize that we will probably have to I guess I think the way it was put was along the lines of, we expect that when we start actually using this stuff in anger, then we will find that there are things we have to change. But we're at the point where there was a reasonable consensus that it would be better to start trying to use it in anger and see what needed to change rather than trying to guess what would need to change before using it. There was a really good point about the fact that we don't really get to mess with HTTP route as much as we might like to. There was a little bit of discussion about the Gateway API 0.6 review. The most interesting thing that came out of that was some discussion about the possibility of the Gateway API people thinking it would be nice to split out the front end and back end functionality of a service in some different ways. So several of us were interested in learning more about that. I'll spare you all the rabbit holes around HTTP 3. That conflicts are weird point in the doc boils down to nobody's terribly happy with the idea that we just say a consumer route always takes precedence over a provider route. But again, it's probably a reasonable way to get started right now and then see what things change. Because conflict handling is strange. What was the other thing? Headless services. Headless services had some interesting conversation because it's not entirely unstraightforward to think about how to deal with headless services where only one headless service maps to a given set of backends. And as soon as you start talking about overlapping services, it becomes somewhere between not straightforward and impossible, depending on lots and lots of things. There's a note in here about we're going to be chatting asynchronously about this. I don't think that actually happened. Everybody was okay with saying, well, everybody accepted that defining the overlapping endpoints behavior as implementation specific was okay. And there was some question about whether the non-overlapping endpoint case should be implementation specific or extended or what. There was also a note that implementation specific and extended have carefully defined meanings, namely that extended means there are compliance tests and implementation specifics means there are not compliance tests. So there's an important difference between those two. And since Shane is on the call, I'll ask him to keep me honest about my sense of those two definitions. Okay, maybe Shane's not actually on the call. Maybe he's
No,
just...
I'm here. I'm sorry. No, that definition is correct. Extended
Okay,
is
good.
when implementation specific is when you don't have conformance tests. Extended is when you do, plus it's where we put things that actually have more than one implementation. So it's not just conformance tests, but it's implied.
I believe also, am I correct in remembering that a given implementation can be conformant without executing the the conformance test for extended behavior?
Correct.
Do I remember? Okay. That was the other thing that I found important, because that was the difference between extended and core, right?
Yeah.
Correct. You can be
everything
just
except-
core. Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
somebody else was talking.
Yeah, extended, you can pick and choose. Like we might implement one or two extended features, but not all of them.
Yeah. But that was a thing where it was clearly not something that everybody on the call last time had already internalized. So I thought that distinction was worth calling out again. That when we say things like core and extended and implementation specific, there are very specific meanings attached to those. It's kind of like the difference between should and may and must if you're reading an RFC. And it's important to recognize that those don't always overlap exactly with their English definitions. I think that covers everything. Am I the only one who was here last week? I think Lewin was, right? But
You were the only one on the call? Just did the whole agenda yourself?
oh, sorry. I believe that last week. Well, okay, looking over the lists here.
Looks like Lewan was here too, but
Yeah,
I
Lewin was
I was
here.
just messing with it.
Yeah, but also John was there, Cage was there. I'm just looking over the list of attendees this week. So I'm not the only one this week who was here last week. Excellent. So
I just wanted to watch the recording of you just talking to yourself. That would have been.
Well, you know, I mean, we can set that up anytime you like. It'll probably be a really
Gateway
short
API
recording. I won't have a
comedy
lot to
hour.
say. But yeah, if anybody else who was on the call disagrees with my recap there, let me know.
Great recap. Thank you for that, because I wasn't there either.
thank you.
It's very
Much
helpful.
appreciated.
Cool. Makes me really glad we kept the notes from last week. So
All right. Yeah, definitely. I tried to check out the recording, but it looks like it hadn't quite been posted yet last time I looked. So hopefully that'll be up by now or soon. All right, so that is our agenda for today. Yeah, I guess Shane, is there anything that is relevant to this group that we're trying to get wrapped up before the Gateway API 060 release?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head that's specifically relevant. Hang on, now you're making me rack my brain.
Yeah, no, I can't think of anything either. I think we're in a reasonable spot right now, but there's some longer term discussions to have in preparation for 070, where I think we had a goal of having some mesh concepts well thought out and formalized and fully approved at that point.
Yeah. And then just for this, it's kind of not a V060 thing, but we did decide last night between the Gamma maintainers and the Gateway API maintainers that we're going to make a Gepster just for Gamma to help kind of keep things focused on Gamma in one place, which also will help with making sure we can assign reviews more appropriately.
All right. With that, this is an open agenda. If there's any topics that anyone would like to discuss at this time, please feel free to add them to the agenda. We're happy to make some time for that, or I will find some stuff to follow up on. But yeah, we can certainly we have time. So any topics that are on people's minds that we would like to spend some time discussing, let's go. John, you want to start with conflicting protocol routes?
Yeah, actually, I realized I maybe have two things. So there's been kind of two open PRs for a while on enhancing the GEP. The first is the namespace boundary stuff. I think Keith approved it, but it's not actually approved. I don't know if that's because he did it through GitHub instead of the slash commands, or if it needs someone else. But I think we established that we wanted that to merge, so if someone could take a look at that. We could do that. The other thing, though, is what I want to talk about was the other one, which is allowing non-HTTP types, which is this conflicting thing. So the main open question for that is what happens when we define multiple different routes of different protocol types for the same service. So you can imagine a TCP route and HTTP route for the same service and same port, I guess, specifically is really the issue. If it's on different ports, it's probably pretty easy to resolve, right? So this is something that's not really discussed in Gateway for Ingress, which is largely because you have the listener to kind of tell you which protocol the routes need to be. I think it's not currently supported to, like, you can't actually have a TCP route and HTTP route for the same listener in Gateway because the protocol and the listener defines what routes are valid. And we don't let you attach a TCP route to an HTTP protocol listener, although technically it would work if we wanted to define it that way. We didn't, so we sidestepped this problem. We did reintroduce the problem in Ingress with gRPC route and HTTP route, though. Both of those can be defined on the same port, and we need to do something there. So that's left undefined, and mesh is entirely undefined. So kind of the question is, how do we want to resolve those conflicts? I've been talking for a while, so I'll put out some ideas, but then I want to cede to the other people. One idea is that we just have a strict hierarchy of some protocol takes precedence over others, like HTTP route, then TCP routes, then TLS routes, or whatever order we want. I don't know, we could do something else. I wanted to get some feedback. I think for HTTP route and gRPC route, well, that's kind of outside the scope of mesh, specifically how we should handle that. It should probably not just be like one takes complete precedence over the other, given that gRPC route is effectively an HTTP route. But I think we probably don't need to decide that here, and we can inherit the decision from the Ingress side. I don't know, does anyone have any strong thoughts on this?
John, do I remember correctly from last week that I seem to remember vaguely some discussion about the Gateway API generally seeming to favor more specific things over less specific things? Am I just imagining that, or was that a thing that we talked about last week?
I don't remember it, but it's been a long time since last week. So, oh, actually, no, it's on
It's been
the
a whole
notes.
week. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have
So
this I have this really vague feeling that one of the principles we talked about was that Gateway API already had this more specific over less specific idea, which could provide some help in terms of resolving conflicts like this.
Yeah, I guess the question that I would have is, do we, let's say we have an HTTP route and a TCP route for the same port, right?
Mhm.
Now, the HTTP route's obviously more specific,
Mhm.
I would say. So we want to match that first. Now, the question would be, if the route doesn't match, then do we fall back to the TCP route or not? It's technically implementable either way. It becomes potentially a bit weird, because if I'm defining a TCP route, I might assume that my traffic is being TCP proxied, but obviously we need to actually terminate the HTTP in order to tell if it matches HTTP routes. So you end up with some kind of weird behavior. It should be implementable, I would imagine, at least in Envoy. I guess how you would implement it would be like, if there's no, like, you would just add a wildcard to HTTP match, which then becomes the TCP match. Again, I'm not trying to focus too much on Envoy, it's just what I'm familiar with. I don't think it could do that for TLS though. Like, if you missed all the HTTP matches, there's no way to then like go back to do a TLS match in Envoy.
Well,
Um,
especially because you have to already terminate the TLS connection to be able to even start receiving the HTTP headers. So
That's what I thought at first, but in this case, I think the TLS route from mesh would be passing through the user's TLS, right? Not terminating.
that's an interesting
We're not
question.
terminating egress TLS in mesh.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, actually.
I feel like TLS route is almost like a separate question because it's so weird.
Costin has
Costin?
a hand up.
Yeah, I think Envoy and Kubernetes are kind of acting as a distortion for very simple things in the internet. And the fact that we can implement whatever with Envoy and Kubernetes may allow all kind of weird things, you know, that's interesting. But in reality, when application port, you know, it's either HTTP or TLS or TCP. It has a clear intent, and the admin, whoever is providing that service, can tell people what it is. And we don't need to guess from other things. I mean, I don't know how it can be expressed. I mean, with application port or with, but it's clearly that whoever the person who needs to decide what the port is a person who's publishing that particular port, and they need one way or another to express what that port is and to declare what the port is. And there are different ways to do it, but I don't think guessing and resolving conflict between route and using this heuristics or whatever Envoy can do is really the solution.
So I'm
Yeah,
guessing that means that you would be in favor of, if you have an HTTP route, then you only use the HTTP routes. You don't try and mix and match
Not
protocols.
even that. Not even that. I think the owner of an HTTP service should somehow declare that it's an HTTP service, and it doesn't matter if you have a route, you don't have a route, you have multiple routes. It's whatever the owner of the service declares, because they know exactly what they're exposing. They know that their application is expecting HTTP. And whoever else wants to talk TCP, doesn't matter. I mean, it's really the intent of the publisher, because nobody else knows what the application is doing except the publisher.
And you can implement the fallback behavior by just having a slash rule on the HTTP route. Like if that's behavior that you really want, you shouldn't need a separate TCP route to do it, I think.
I tend to agree with Costin's point that all the prior art I can think of involves a port having a single protocol associated with it and being able to do things like, oh, if we can't route TCP or can't route HTTP, let's try it as a raw TLS route. Seems, or a raw TCP route, either way. That feels a little strange to me. Having said that, the gRPC versus HTTP thing is a little more surreal to me. Like I could conceivably imagine maybe possibly a little bit that if you don't get a valid gRPC method, you just route the rest of it as HTTP. But even there, I'd probably be inclined to say that's asking for trouble more than anything else.
But the gRPC is HTTP, so I'm not talking about what you do over HTTP. So you can have an HTTPS port that is multiplexing multiple things, and that can be HTTP, because again, there was a discussion about who's, you know, over TLS, who decides what protocol it is. It's Kubernetes, whatever route, whatever, or is a LPN negotiation. And on the internet, is a LPN negotiations that should decide. So once you do a LPN, you know it's HTTP. I mean, if a port is TLS, then you know if it's HTTP, it can be TCP, can be a lot of other things. And then you go to H2, and it could be gRPC, and gRPC just means that you use service/method, so it's really HTTP. I don't think we are talking about you know, Kubernetes APIs overriding the internet standards for, you know, LPN negotiation or for whatever user wants to expose on a HTTP port, be it gRPC or be it plain HTTP. In other words, you should defer to the internet standards and just, you know, specify the minimum that is necessary to express the user intent.
So would it be sufficient to just say that if you have multiple different route types for a single service, we pick the most exact type, which would be HTTP, then TLS, then TCP, I would imagine. And on the least specific ones, we emit some sort of conflict rule. The one concern I have with that is that you maybe have a TCP route that says, like, I don't know, match all of port 80 and send it to XYZ, and someone adds a HTTP route for something specific, and suddenly the TCP one's wiped out.
So I think it wouldn't be wiped out if we follow the guidance from the like the other conflict rules that
The oldest
ends
thing
up like
first,
prioritizing existing things. Would it?
the oldest thing first rule you're talking
Yeah.
about?
Well, in the existing logic, that's kind of the discriminator of last choice.
True.
So if two protocols or two routes are completely equal in terms of priority, then it's based on time.
You
But I mean, we could do that though. We could say the oldest protocol wins in conflict. And then if you want to change it to HTTP, you apply your HTTP routes, they do nothing, then you delete the TCP routes. That would probably be safer.
Yeah, I guess sorry, I was thinking, imagining a case where you have, a catch-all HTTP route with a slash as a prefix, and then somebody adds a more specific prefix, and that one suddenly your catch-all isn't routing all of it. But I think that's a fundamentally different thing. Sorry, Rob, you were going to say?
Yeah, I would just, one of the things we've really struggled with in API usage elsewhere is how we handle or what we expect from stateful controllers, or if we expect controllers to have state. One of the concerns of any approach that, requires on the, it's one thing to say the oldest route, we've done that. It's a different thing to say the route that matched this first, basically, right? You could say the oldest route resource, but it may not have been used to match a given service or destination until more recently. Similar with gateway, similar with anything. Costin, maybe I'm misunderstanding. So you're saying routes are not the source of truth here?
Yeah, that's my point. I mean, it's not just the route that determines what the protocol is. That was my point. So it doesn't matter if the TCP route is attached or not. It matters if the user says that, hey, I have a port that it's TLS, and on TLS I have HTTP2 and other things. That really is a source of truth and should determine if a route is allowed or not. So if someone is specifying a route that is not compatible with the intent of the user, it should be rejected, not the other way around.
So to clarify, are you talking about the service specifications and app protocol? Am I missing something?
That I don't know. I mean, I'm not clear where is the right place to put the intent of the user, in the service, in the pod itself, or some other attachment. I'm not sure about this, but my feeling is that it needs to be something where as an owner of application publishing port 8080, I can specify that port 8080 is the HTTP.
Well, we do have a mechanism to do that with app protocol on the service, right?
Which one?
The service port app protocol.
That's a good one, yes. But is it what we want to do? I mean, do we want to require app protocol to be used and specify HTTP or some syntax to identify?
Well, that was my concern. Like, what happens if they either don't set it or they set it to, I don't know, say TCP, but then define an HTTP route? Do we reject that and make them sync them up? Do we accept it only if it's unset, or we'd have to? It could be done for sure. We just need to define what it means to have those interactions between the routes having a protocol and the service having a protocol.
Yeah, no, but given that there is security implications, I would say, be as conservative as possible. I mean, reject any route if it doesn't match. Try to put an HTTP route on a port that is declared as TCP, then safest thing is to reject the HTTP route, no?
Maybe I do. I mean, like one case I could think of is if you are a consumer route, you may want to apply HTTP route even if the producer of the service doesn't declare themselves as HTTP, right? I think if it's just some third-party service that they didn't bother to set up the protocol, but that it's HTTP, so you want to do an HTTP route, you can't really go tell them to go set the app protocol.
I think that's the same as how it would be with listener. If you just don't set a protocol, then it allows anything to attach to it if it's unspecified.
Isn't it required in listener though?
I don't recall.
Yeah, that may be a good compromise.
It's a little confusing to me because it seems like there are going to be some services out there that you could use TCP, gRPC, or HTTP route all to route to the same destination service, and all could be valid even if they're not equally useful or configurable. And only I think what we're describing is just a way of defining preference here, but not disallowing other route types. But I just want to make sure that we allow any valid route type to route to a service and not like prevent that based on app protocol or something like that. I
agree
think
with
that's
you.
what others are saying, but I just want to be sure.
I completely agree. I mean, to be clear, if it's an HTTP service, it should allow both gRPC, TCP, and HTTP routes. But if it's a TCP service, it should only allow TCP route because it's clearly the user explicitly say it's a TCP. That was my. But I agree.
Okay.
If put a TCP route and an HTTP route should apply, and because TCP route may have port-based, ranges and whatever CIDRs to route on, and then HTTP will do the higher level routing, so they are compatible with each other.
So Costin, if I had an HTTP service and I had an HTTP route matching /foo and TCP route just matching the port, in terms of how we would configure that in, let's just say Envoy, that would become two HTTP matches, one on /foo and one on match anything, essentially. Like we basically turn the TCP route into an HTTP route effectively.
Or we apply the TCP route first and then apply the HTTP route. So it's first of all, TCP listener and filter. And then
right. Yeah. My only concern with that is that in general, the API favors more specific match first. Which I guess, I mean, comparing apples to oranges, who's to say what's more specific, but to me, HTTP seems more specific than TCP.
I would think so, and I would think gRPC.
I would agree with
is
that.
more specific.
I think
Also, the more specific thing applying conflicting out the TCP one, it isn't the worst because at least it fails fast. I would think that you would see the change immediately when you went to apply it, and assuming you're following best practices of applying stuff in the staged environment first, it should be an apparent change rather than something that is implicit behavior that's difficult to detect.
Mike, FYI, checking the gateway API gateway type, it looks like the protocol is required in the listener section.
Okay, thanks. Can it have multiple protocols or is a single one required?
Looks like a single one.
Okay. That makes this a little easier, maybe.
Yeah, protocol type is a string. It can only just be the one. Although, I don't know, maybe there's some... No, you can't do anything like HTTP, TCP, whatever.
Yeah, right now we are tied to a single protocol, and you can imagine a protocol like I don't think we have a way on listener right now to specify gRPC anyways, but if we did, you can imagine something like that would be compatible with multiple route types.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we already have prior art around, you should have a single protocol attached to a port. I think that kind of points us in the direction of doing something similar for Gamma. rather than trying to do something new with merging and fallback.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. Just on the principle of least surprise. All right, I gotta ask, John, what kind of keyboard are you typing on?
Sorry, I was some crappy
Loud
logic I
kind.
I'm like, yeah. So I guess that if we go with what Mike
Speaking
said,
as
which
somebody that I'm pretty convinced my keyboard is audible too. So
John, if
Um,
I'm not mistaken, that's just a basic plastic keyboard. You just hit it like crazy with your fingers, am I right?
well, my phone's like literally an inch away from it, so I'm kind of at a weird setup right now. So I guess if we go with what Mike said, which I think I'm tending to agree with that, it at least makes things simpler. We could always expand it later, right? Right. This is kind of a more restrictive option. Then we still just need to decide, do we go with oldest protocol wins or most specific protocol wins, right? Or a third option, but those are the two that I've heard mentioned.
What do you mean by oldest protocol?
So let's say I first apply TCP route and then later an HTTP route. And when I say later, I mean in terms of creation timestamp.
Okay. Okay. That's
so. Yeah, which one wins basically? Is it the
First
HTTP route
created.
because it's more specific, or is it the TCP
First-
route because
first-
it's first and we don't want to wipe it out
Sorry.
accidentally, right?
Or both. I mean, or both apply. That's the other option.
How would
Yeah,
both
mean,
that is
apply?
the other option. Well, that's
I
kind of
would
the
step-
other. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Rob.
I would step back a second and say that even though you can specify a single protocol on Gateway Listener, we specifically have put a lot of effort into supported route kinds, right? So you as a consumer or as a user can specify these are the kinds of routes I want this listener to support. And the implementation can tell you what kinds it actually supports in status. So you could set an HTTP protocol, and I imagine at least some implementations are going to take that and say, I support both HTTP and gRPC route. So I think there probably is going to be some scenarios where a single listener supports both. I don't want to go too far into this idea that we only have a single protocol per listener, because it is a single protocol, but not necessarily a single route type.
Do we have anything explicitly written about how that should be handled for listeners in North-South Gateway yet?
I've been trying to dig it up. Somehow I thought that we had said it was mutually exclusive to start, but I can't find that written anywhere. gRPC route was really the first thing we ran into, and it's experimental. So as much as you technically could mix and match TCP and HTTP, I don't see a clear use case for it. Maybe I'm just not creative enough.
Actually, I'm starting to see some use cases. I mean, given that TCP route is based on CIDR ranges and IP addresses and operates at TCP level, there is a valid use case for someone to apply TCP routes for an HTTP to HTTP traffic. So because you deny or send traffic from Russia to DevNull or to some specific server. So basically apply some TCP routes first based on CIDR ranges, and then the HTTP routes would apply like with normal, firewall separation. I mean, you apply the routes, the TCP routes, maybe at the router level. Don't even do them in Envoy or the gateway. Just translate them into firewall rules and into routes basically. And then HTTP routes will combine. And then gRPC, it's effectively, you can have an HTTP server that exposes both gRPC and HTTP, and it really is not under the control of the route. So gRPC route can be translated into HTTP routes. They're equivalent syntactically. So basically, you apply them in order from the at the layer order. Basically, you first apply TCPs, then you apply HTTP routes, then you apply gRPC routes.
That's fair. just to clarify, although we very temporarily experimented with IP range matching in TCP route, it does not exist today.
But it will exist at
And
some point because the use case.
yeah, I agree. It's very likely to come back. So that's a good example.
Yeah, both for security. I mean, you want to route Russia somewhere, or for also regional. You need to keep traffic regional, process Europe traffic only in Europe, and whatever is called the regulation. John, what do you think? Are you okay with this approach?
Maybe we lost him. I'm not sure.
Sorry, if you're talking about me, I had to go to a different meeting room, so you did lose me for a minute.
No worries. Yeah, we're just curious. I get. Well, maybe Costin, you can ask better than I can.
No, I was wondering what do you think about applying routes, layers. So basically, apply first TCP routes, apply then HTTP routes, and then apply gRPC routes, just like in Envoy, and how it will happen on a decoupled system where TCP routes are applied by a different system, a router, and then HTTP routes are applied by an HTTP load balancer that doesn't know gRPC, and finally gRPC routes are applied locally.
Yeah, part of me likes it because it's much easier to apply TCP routes first and then fall back to HTTP routes. Part of me doesn't like it because it kind of conflicts with the idea that most specific route wins. And I mean, I don't think we need to solve HTTP and gRPC route precedence in mesh because it's more of a general problem, but I tend to think that they shouldn't be so orthogonal. It seems a bit odd that like all HTTP routes have higher precedence than gRPC routes or vice versa. But I don't want to get too hung up on gRPC semantics here necessarily.
I like the direction you were going. I think it was you, John, that you were going of basically anything from a lower level can be translated to some kind of common understanding, right? So that's especially clear with gRPC and HTTP, which are basically going to be translated to the same set of matchers.
Yeah.
And you can kind of stretch that and say, well, TCP could largely also be translated to the same set of matchers in most cases anyways.
Sorry, TCP could be translated to the same set of matchers as what?
As HTTP. If TCP right now is limited to port matching, I don't know. It depends how far we go on
One
TCP.
could argue that HTTP route should always be a superset of TCP route, even if we had more fields, right? Because
Well, again, I'm gonna point out HTTP 3, you guys.
Fair.
Yeah, so I mean, the basic idea that an HTTP route should be more specific than a TCP or UDP route makes an enormous amount of sense to me. The idea that a gRPC route you could consider to be more specific than HTTP, or you could view it as their peers, because gRPC is HTTP. But yeah, H3 really does mess with a really ridiculous amount of stuff and what we're talking about. Brief aside here, Rob, was it GEP 724 that was talking about the supported route kinds?
Maybe I'll double check, but yeah.
That's the only thing that I was able to find, but the concept that the idea that a gateway can say, hey, these are the kinds of routes that this listener can support, that kind of does make a lot of sense to me too. I'm just not sure how we would convey that in mesh land.
Yeah, I mean, if there ever were a global mesh resource or a cluster-wide mesh resource, that would be a really convenient place to say, hey, by the way, here are the things that I support.
I certainly do like the idea of adding a status to say, hey, you know, this particular route is going to be ignored because you did something incompatible with other stuff. I'm kind of leaning towards we should define a specificity and then let the most specific thing win, because that feels to me the most consistent with existing things out there in the world. But yeah, I don't know. It's a tough call.
Is it consistent with other things in the world? Because in the world, you know, TCP routes apply at routers. That means that's my point here, that in the world, there is no the most specific wins, but they're combined. I mean, they're applying independently. And
In my world, I have seen a lot of places where you can't have an HTTP route and a TCP route on the same port.
no, I'm saying different equipment. I mean, different servers, different admins, different. There is a TCP admin that is dealing with BGP and routing and routers and firewalls, and there is a load balancer admin that is on HTTP.
Yeah, in my world also, I am most accustomed to looking at things from the perspective of an application developer. And BGP is not something an application developer thinks about. BGP is a thing where they trust that the person who set up IP underneath them did something sane, right? So from the perspective of an app developer, it's very natural to think about things like, oh, hey, port 573 is already in use for a TCP route, so I should probably not try to put my HTTP server on that port. And, you know, that's a pretty sane thing. Likewise, people generally don't try to do raw TCP routing on port 80 when there's also an HTTP server there. So, you know, I'm biased, 100% biased in this, by the way. Like, I recognize that.
No, I completely agree with you, and that used to be true when the internet was plain text and the ports were simple. But nowadays, with you know, a lot of people multiplex almost everything over HTTPS for gateways. That's actually not for Gamma, but because it's very common. Other ports are blocked because friendly ISPs and you know, everyone is sending everything over HTTPS and you know, even WebSocket on top of it and other things. So, and by the way, WebSocket route is probably going to be one important one.
Every place I've seen something like that happen, then by the time the Ingress controller gets a hold of it, it's being demultiplexed.
Yeah.
Because, and that implies that by the time Gamma gets a hold of it, it's being demultiplexed as well. Because by definition, Gamma is dealing with the inside of the cluster. And I don't see people doing that kind of multiplexing inside a cluster.
Actually, I agree with you. I think that's the difference between Gamma and Gateway. I mean, for Gateway, probably it's a composition. I mean, apply all of them in the.
I could certainly imagine an Ingress controller that needed to do the demultiplexing for sure. I haven't seen it in practice in my own career, just because of, honestly, because the stuff that I've been doing in my own career is from the perspective of the application developer, and we tried really hard to not make them think about stuff like that. But yeah, I don't think that that's a thing that Gamma is going to need to worry about. This is, of course, the point where John and Rob stand up and go, oh, no, ambient mesh has to do it. But maybe not. So again, my strong bias is start with the perspective that, no, you don't get to run multiple protocols over the same ports. Just pick a protocol for a port and, you know, go with the most specific protocol if there are conflicts, and tell the user that something went wrong if there's a conflict. That's
where I lean to as well. I think it's very uncommon for this situation to actually happen. And so rejecting it with a plain status message seems probably sufficient.
I would agree with you. My only concern is when we need to implement that CIDR based stuff for everything, because there is a customer is required by regulation to do whatever. How do we do that? Then we start adding CIDR ranges to HTTP route to express the requirement, or what do we do? Because normally the CIDR, it's better to be isolated in the IP routing. And that particular use case, it's, clearly exists because.
Well,
Is
which
your-
one takes precedence? Is it the CIDR route or is it the HTTP
Yeah.
route?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's
Well-
because CIDR applies first. I mean, in normal internet, if you forget Kubernetes, that's how it works. You have a router that is applying CIDR ranges, and then it goes to a load balancer that is doing HTTP.
I don't know. I mean, if you have like Linux routing table and you define a route for a /32 CIDR and a route for a /16 CIDR, the more specific one wins, right?
Mhm.
The HTTP route's effectively bound to a single IP address, so that seems more specific than a range.
Sorry, can I just to double check, Kostin, are you, and I apologize, I feel like I missed some of this earlier. Are you thinking about CIDR for ingress routing or egress routing or east-west routing?
All of them is a use case of keeping, European traffic in Europe, for example, applies for everything, including in network. So you are saying everything coming from Europe will be routed to servers in Europe. And that is best expressed with CIDR ranges or network policies to deny everything.
That
And-
implies that you have a single IP space that spans multiple geographic zones.
IPv6 probably allows that long term. I'm not so worried about the space. But my real, I mean, let me tell you why I'm prefer this option. Is that what we are doing in Istio with Envoy, combining everything, is one option. But in reality, you may want to split it to different layers. So you may want to put all the TCP routes to translate them into, either program whatever fabric you have for TCP and CNI, so your VPC, and then translate the HTTP routes to program some, front ends that are, multi-tenant or whatever, and then apply the gRPC routes at a more specific load balancer. So basically, you can in a way, ambient is a good model for that, where you kind of separate the layers again instead of combining them. And for that, it's better to have a way to clearly separate what goes to the, underlying fabric, what goes to the load balancers that are shared, and what goes to the more specific load balancer, waypoints or whatever we call them.
I think I would really like to see I don't know if it's a use case or an example or case study or something, but as I think over what you're talking about, it's really tricky for me to figure out how exactly that maps into the kinds of concepts that the people who are doing work with existing Kubernetes resources are going to be lining up with. I'm not sure if I'm doing a great job of explaining this, but I feel like there's I feel like the existing, okay, first off, I feel like we are in fact talking about Kubernetes at this point. And second, I feel that the existing Kubernetes resources possibly implicitly are modeling some layers that they are assuming are not going to be combined and then resplit out. So there are a lot of ways that I feel like the case that you're talking about may itself be a little bit at odds with the way Kubernetes is put together. So I would really like to understand the use case that you're talking about better to understand where I'm missing stuff.
Yeah, I can try to write something down. I mean, I'm not strong about it. I'm okay with, because in reality, I suspect what I want will happen anyway with separate APIs, because no matter what we are saying, people who want to configure IP routing will be able to do it at a higher levels than Kubernetes, outside of Kubernetes, because that's more multi-cluster and when you're a single Kubernetes, usually if you're a single regions, you don't have to do that. So it's not necessarily mapping to Kubernetes.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
a
definitely
really-
tend to like skew towards IP-based routing, like that is a layer beneath
Outside.
or outside of the typical mesh concerns.
Yes.
That's actually a good point. That's a very good point. Why do we bother with it?
I mean, a lot of my gut reaction to the problem of using CIDR to keep European traffic within Europe is, okay, why don't I just have a Europe cluster, and then I have a cluster that's in North America, and then I have a cluster that's in Asia, and then I can just get to rely on Kube to already do this for me in a lot of ways. then you get into many more interesting situations around, one of your services in the Asian cluster has died. So how do you route those to between, and that's an entirely different animal.
And some services may be required to stay, other may not be,
Yep.
and all kind of use cases. Yeah, that's why
Yeah.
we need
Yeah.
some control. But
Yeah, but those are things that you could do already with HTTP routing, as long as you understand the way multi-cluster services work and things like that. And that's an entirely separate rabbit hole to be dealing with external services and multi-cluster and mirroring, and all this kind of stuff. But I don't think that we need to build, full-on CIDR routing into the HTTP route to make that work.
no, absolutely. My point was that to avoid bending CID routing in HTTP, we better to combine them instead of having a more specific way.
I think so. As time check, we have about 5 minutes left, so definitely want to try to wrap this up. I just want to kind of close with something of, I think it may be helpful to get a example of how would you express an application that serves multiple protocols through a spec like this, whether that's separate routes, whether that's different kube services, whether that's a single service with multiple ports specified. Let's work through a kind of concrete example of what does this actually feel like in practice to write. Does that feel useful to folks?
I pretty much always think it's useful to do that exercise.
All right. Is there one or more next steps with what we want to do? We had a long discussion that covered a lot of ground here, and I'm indented 6 columns or something like that. Are there specific next steps that folks want to take on to drive a decision of some sort on this? And again, this is all falling out from which issue? Not that one, the other one.
Yeah, I think the consensus seems to be, sorry, it seems to be to have more specific, and I'm happy to withdraw my concerns. I mean, we can fix it later. I mean, we can change it later. It's not incompatible change.
That's pretty much what I was going to say. I feel like we have a consensus towards more specific wins, use a status.
All right. Then I'm going to go update the PR, and those are the only 2 open issues right now for the mesh stuff. So we're probably out of time here, but next week we should probably consider if there's more things we want to do, or if it's ready to mark as implementable, or what's kind of the next steps.
We have 3 more minutes, John. Let's do it now. Does anyone know anything else that would prevent us to move forward?
Anybody who thinks we shouldn't just go ahead and try it out and see what happens?
What is the actual general pattern, Rob, or someone else that's more familiar? Do we mark it as implementable and then go implement it? Do I implement it first and then mark it as implementable once I prove that it can be implemented? What do we do?
Yeah, so I would say we would want to mark something as implementable, and actually usually we would move it to experimental channel. I think one of the things that we still need to follow up back up with is when we did the 060, when we started off with the 060 review with the broader SIG network group of reviewers, which were specifically Tim and Cal, we got some feedback that attaching to a service as a parent was unexpected. And there was, there was some related effort coming through SIG network of pulling out some of the pieces of service, the API, like IP address allocation, as well as DNS resolution, into something else that could be attached to gateway or any other thing that could be very relevant to mesh. I'm not sure that that's a blocker to implementing something like in an experimental state, but it's definitely something that would be a blocker towards moving much further than that. I have it as an AI to try and set up some kind of follow-up discussion on that. There are some people, like, basically we need to loop in people from SIG network that are working on these things with people from Gamma and Gateway API and try and have some big discussion about all of this. It's hard to schedule something with that many people, but that is kind of the next step there. I think we need to clarify how much of a concern that is, whether that's a blocker or just a let's keep on discussing this while we consider it experimental.
Rob, would it
Everything I
help-
heard before about that work with splitting service out implied that was a timeline of months, which feels like it would be really rough to block everything until then, right?
Yeah, I
Rob, would it help to change the language to say, instead of we are touching to service, we can attach to service or equivalent features? So basically it's to not say we strictly attach to a service, but we can attach to any object that represents group of workloads.
yeah.
So in future, because even if we define this brand new split, people will take a very long time to adopt, and we still want to be able to express that you attach to service if only service is available.
I think
Yeah.
that's something that we have the design space to be able to do. Like the field in the spec is not named service, it's parent ref. If and when a DNS name parent ref or DNS name resource becomes a thing, we could add something to Gamma to allow attaching to that instead.
Yeah.
But I would definitely lean towards that over trying to block something on something that may be months or years in development.
Yeah, no,
And
I
service
think
will not
that's
go away. I mean, I don't think service will go away. It's a V1 API. It will never be removed. So we'll always have the use case of attaching service.
yeah. So to clarify, I think that's unlikely to block, but we have not considered anything. For the sake of 060, we've considered this an informational only review on Gamma. We have not tried to include any part of Gamma in 060. So I don't think anything is a formal blocker, but we will not consider any Gamma spec part of the 060 release as a result. So we can provide some guidance of, hey, this is a thing that we are considering experimental, but it's not going to be part of the 060 release. So
I think that makes a lot of sense.
Sounds good to me.
Cool.
All right. With that, we are out of time, so we'll wrap it up. As always, thanks everyone. Definitely appreciate the discussion and take
Thank
care.
you.
And have a good rest of the day.
Yep.